In the heart of Beijing's financial district, beneath layers of glass towers and guarded by the quiet confidence of sovereign power, lies one of the most formidable weapons in modern economic history. It is not a missile. It is not a stealth jet. It does not explode. It accumulates. Inside those vaults sits more than $3 trillion in foreign currency reserves. That figure exceeds the entire gross domestic product of the United Kingdom. It is the largest stockpile ever assembled by a single government, but few outside. The halls of central banks and trade ministries understand what it truly represents. Every dollar in that reserve came from somewhere, not from conquest, not from leverage, but from American consumers, filling carts in Walmart and Target, buying phones, clothes, kitchenware, and electronics. It was earned transaction by transaction. Over years and decades, in plain sight, economic theory called it efficiency. Policy leaders called it globalization. China saw something else. It saw an opportunity to turn trade into power. And power into strategy, not loudly, but precisely. Because in the game of international currency, the strongest move is often the quietest, and for 2 decades, China has been playing a longer game than anyone imagined. Throughout history, the most powerful nations have rarely held control through force alone. They have done it through currency. When a nation's money becomes the world's reference point, the thing that others borrow in, save in, and settle debts in, it gains something unique: silent authority. In 1717, Great Britain moved toward this position without fully realizing it. Isaac Newton, as master of the Royal Mint, set the gold-to-silver exchange rate in a way that unintentionally placed the British pound on a gold standard. What followed was not abstract policy. It was global influence, because anyone who wished to settle trade internationally, finance large projects, or protect wealth needed pounds, and by extension, Britain. This monetary structure helped finance the empire, fund wars abroad, and centralize commerce in London. Britain was not merely exporting manufactured goods. It was exporting a financial system centuries later, in 1944. The United States repeated the strategy, this time on purpose. At Bretton Woods, American negotiators established a new monetary order. The dollar would be exchangeable for gold, and every other major currency would peg itself to the dollar. The result was historic. The United States could now print money, and the world had to accept it. The French would later call it an exorbitant privilege, the near-magical ability to shift domestic costs overseas by issuing debt in your own currency. But empires are not held by magic. They are held by trust. Trust that your currency is stable, your institutions are reliable, and your debts will be paid. And once that trust is in place, the issuer of the currency gains something far greater than financial strength. They gain leverage. What China has constructed over the past 2 decades is not an economic accident. It is a deliberate, multi-phase strategy designed to turn trade dominance into structural leverage, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. The plan has unfolded in 3 strategic stages, each building on the last, each calculated for maximum long-term impact and minimal short-term risk. Stage 1: accumulation through exports. It began in 2001. When China joined the World Trade Organization, this move opened global markets to Chinese goods. But more importantly, it allowed China to engineer an artificially underpriced currency by pegging the yuan to the US dollar at a low exchange rate. This peg made Chinese exports cheap and irresistible. Every time an American company or consumer purchased Chinese-made goods, dollars flowed into China, but instead of letting the yuan rise, the People's Bank of China printed more yuan to buy up those incoming dollars, keeping their exchange rate stable. The result? A growing stockpile of US dollars, which China converted directly into massive holdings of US Treasury bonds. By 2013, China held over $1.3 trillion in US debt. American consumers were spending, and China was lending that money right back to the US government. Stage 2: reallocation into influence. Around 2014, China began scaling back its US Treasury purchases. This was not a crisis sell-off. It was a strategic shift as Treasury holdings declined. China began pouring capital into the Belt and Road Initiative, financing ports, highways, and rail in over 150 developing nations. China also began accumulating gold, increasing official reserves while likely holding additional amounts unreported. Instead of holding Western paper debt, China was buying hard infrastructure and hard commodities, assets that cannot be printed, inflated, or politically frozen. Stage 3. Infrastructure beyond the dollar. Since 2015, China has built its own SWIFT alternative, the CIPS system, allowing global partners to trade in yuan without touching Western financial rails. As of 2025, over 1,400 banks in more than 100 countries are connected, with local currency settlements rising, gold stockpiles growing, and Belt and Road ties deepening. China is no longer just using dollars, it is replacing the reason to use them. By 2025, China still holds approximately $759 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, a staggering sum by any measure. But what makes this position extraordinary is that neither side can safely act on it. China owns enough U.S. debt that, if sold off rapidly, it could severely destabilize U.S. financial markets. A mass liquidation would spike bond yields, drive up interest rates, and sharply increase the cost of servicing America's $36 trillion national debt. That sort of shock could trigger a recession, cause widespread budgetary strain, and rattle global investor confidence. But here is the paradox. China cannot pull the trigger either. Dumping treasuries would strengthen the yuan, damage China's export competitiveness, and slow its already moderating economy. Such a move would also devalue existing holdings and signal panic, the very outcome China has spent 2 decades avoiding. This is not leverage in the traditional sense. It is what economists call strategic entrapment, a state where each side holds tools that are too dangerous to use. But within that stillness lies power, because the United States can no longer credibly threaten China with financial isolation. The globe has watched as Russian banks were cut from SWIFT and assets frozen overnight. But China is no longer as exposed. It has gold. It has yuan-based payment channels. It has Belt and Road dependencies. And it has just enough U.S. assets to wield influence without being fully vulnerable to retaliation. China has transformed its U.S. holdings from an economic asset into a geopolitical shield. By staying partially inside the dollar system but building multiple exits, China controls the tempo. The checkmate is not in the move, it is in the threat of movement. And America, encumbered by its own debt, can do little to respond without harming itself. The last time an Asian export powerhouse threatened to overtake the American economy, it did not end in a trade war. It ended at the Plaza Hotel in New York. In 1985, Japan's economy was surging. Its cars, electronics, and industrial machinery were dominating global markets, just as China's exports do today. But as the U.S. trade deficit widened and domestic pressure grew, American policymakers demanded action. The result was the Plaza Accord, an agreement between the United States, Japan, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom to intervene in currency markets and deliberately weaken the U.S. dollar. What sounded like cooperation was, in practice, a forced sacrifice. Japan agreed to allow the yen to rise. Within 2 years, it had doubled in value, devastating Japan's exporters and setting off a chain reaction that led to decades of stagnation. Japan's attempt to revive growth through cheaper credit only inflated bubbles in real estate and stocks, bubbles that burst, leaving millions trapped in what became known as the lost decades. China studied the Plaza Accord with surgical intensity. It understood that Japan's mistake was not economic, it was political. Japan wanted Western approval. It operated within Western forums. It trusted that shared success meant shared stability. China drew a different lesson. Never allow external powers to dictate your currency policy. Since then, it has refused to let the yuan float freely. It has never placed itself fully at the mercy of dollar-based institutions. And it has resisted every encouragement or pressure to conform. Where Japan sought to cooperate, China planned to outlast, and now, China is reaping the benefits of controlled independence, while avoiding the fate that derailed Japan's rise. China's strategy was never about overthrowing the dollar. It was about replacing the reason to need it for decades. The narrative assumed that any challenge to U.S. currency dominance would arrive boldly in a headline. A confrontation or a new global reserve emerging overnight. But power does not always shift with noise. Sometimes it shifts in silence with one infrastructure project, one reduced treasury holding, one local currency trade settlement at a time. And now, the system is changing. Quietly, permanently. Over 1,400 banks across 110 countries have joined China's CIPS system, yuan-based payment platform functioning outside of SWIFT. Chinese exports continue to bring in over $1 trillion annually in surplus. But instead of recycling those dollars back into treasuries, China is buying gold, building global trade routes, and strengthening alternate financial rails at the same time. Countries that rely on China's investment through Belt and Road are becoming less dependent on the dollar and more integrated into China's economic orbit. The result is not a violent break, but a slow migration away from U.S. financial hegemony. What makes China's position so effective is that it has achieved leverage without becoming reckless. By maintaining exposure to dollar assets, it ensures that the United States cannot retaliate without hurting itself. But by diversifying tactically into gold, infrastructure, and parallel systems, it ensures that over time, America's tools of enforcement lose power. The system no longer serves America alone, and yet, American consumers continue spending. U.S. debt continues to rise. And the world continues watching how this imbalance evolves, not just economically, but strategically. This is not just a currency shift. It is a geopolitical trap designed not to collapse today's system, but to outgrow it. If the most powerful tool in your system is money, what happens when your greatest rival no longer needs it?